Good morning, everybody. It's great to be with you. It is a nice morning. I could not believe how warm it was when I stepped outside this morning. Welcome to October. It is warmer than July this year. I remember in July saying, what a beautiful October morning, and now here we are, and we're just going back and forth, so that's great. We'll have a little fun. Well, before we get into it, I want to give you one more announcement, because we are going to try something new this year. Me and Marilyn Swedberg have partnered to put together what we're calling Equipping the Saints. So we want to have a few opportunities throughout the year for you to come, anyone to come, and just dig deeper with us on just being equipped to be faithful to God. As we've been talking about in this series in Daniel, what does it look like to be faithful to God? And specifically in Daniel, what does it look like to engage in culture well, to live in a Babylon-type society? So we want to have a deeper conversation on that and really help each other with figuring out what is culture, how do we interact with it, how do we share the gospel in this culture, how do we be faithful to God in the midst of the world we live in. So Saturday, October 14th, mark your calendar, we'll be in the Ministry Center, try out the new space from 9 a.m. to noon on a Saturday morning. There will be coffee and donuts. It will be great. So we'd love to have you come and join us for that. Well, we are continuing, as I just mentioned, in our series on Daniel, which has been so much fun to go through. God has been teaching me a lot in this series. And really just about, like I mentioned, what does it look like to be faithful, especially when so many challenges are coming your way. And there's no shortage of challenges for the main characters in our story of Daniel. And I don't know about you, but when I face a challenge, I need some encouragement. I need some motivation to keep going, to stay faithful. And above all, I need hope. That's what we're talking about today. Daniel 2 gives us a vision of hope. Now, I love American history. I especially love presidential history. I like to read different books about them, hear their biographies, dig in deeper. And one of the unique things about our presidents is that every time they go campaigning, they like to give a slogan that really points to hope. That they're trying to give hope to a nation and say, I'm the person that can lead you to a better future, to a place of hope. And this is often represented in whatever their slogan or their tagline is. And we've seen this with every president. The last few years, they've looked like this: build back better, make America great again, a change we can believe in, all things that are saying look forward to a better future to try to provide hope to their country. Now, despite their best efforts, it doesn't always work out as good as they hoped for. In fact, I did some research over the last 15 years, and I looked at various studies, and maybe you find something different, but I think this is close. And just how successful are they in some of the promises that they make to achieve that hope? And in the last 15 years, about 44% of their promises have been fulfilled, about 30% broken, and then there's this quarter of them that are somewhere in the middle of a compromise, or it's hard to tell. So they come with a message, but it often doesn't get followed through on in the way that they hoped for, in the way that we hoped for when we elected them. And that makes sense to me. I believe that, because what I've experienced in this life is that often the sources of hope that we find in this world end up falling short in some way. Because it's hard to find true hope sometimes in a world whose leaders say one thing and then do another thing. And sometimes we get discouraged. Now, I have to admit, I also looked back at some of my favorite slogans, and these ones are just, Ross for boss. That's fantastic. Ross Perot. Oh, he didn't win. Maybe this is why. Maybe there's other reasons. I don't know, that sticker isn't giving me hope. And then this one, though, just takes them all. Vote Carter, not just peanuts. He just wants you to know what he's all about. These are fantastic. I had fun digging. I maybe spent too much time going back and looking at all the past slogans. This one I had to look up and see, is this real? Yes. And see, the sad thing is I'm making fun of Georgia today, and Joel's not even here. He missed out. And I've never made fun of Georgia before. It's so far away, I usually don't care. But anyway, the problem is, the places that we try to place our hope in this world often fall short for us. But thankfully, what we're going to see in Daniel 2 today is the Bible offers a different vision of hope. A vision of hope that is reliable. A vision of hope that comes in the form of a rock coming down from heaven. And I'm so thankful that the Bible gives us this vision. So the big idea that we're running after today, that we're going to see, is this idea that Christ is that solid rock on which we stand. He is the rock that provides us with hope, a hope that is sure, a hope that is reliable, a hope that we can stand on. But before we dig into that, this is part 2. We're going through the second half of Daniel chapter 2 today. So let's just do a really quick recap. What did we cover the last week as we were looking at the first half of Daniel 2? And last week we saw that King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, and it terrified him. And he asked his advisors not only to interpret the dream, but to tell him what it was without giving any hints. He wanted to be sure of the outcome, the interpretation of this dream. And they said they couldn't interpret the dream for him, so he threatened to have them all killed. But then Daniel was able to receive from God this vision, because God reminded us in this story that ultimately he is the one in control. So now Daniel, equipped with the interpretation of this dream, is on his way to the king to save his own life, if he interprets it correctly, and also to save the lives of the other wise men in Babylon. So that's where we pick up our story this morning. If you want to open your Bibles to Daniel chapter 2, we're going to start in verse 24. But before we do, I like in every series to give you some more resources if you're someone that likes to dig in a little bit deeper. So today I just want to highlight a few. I always like to highlight Bible Project. It's so helpful. You'll see even on my office right now, I've got sort of the overview charts of the book of Daniel from the Bible Project, but particularly on today's sermon, Tim Mackey was really helpful, one of the founders of Bible Project, in helping me understand what this chapter is all about. And the Spoken Gospel podcast is another one if you want to dig a little bit deeper while you're mowing the lawn of what's going on in the Bible. But if you're more of a reader, Thriving in Babylon is a really easier read that's accessible and challenging from one of my favorite authors, in Larry Osborne, just talking about how do we thrive in a culture like the one in Daniel. And then Faith for Exiles is a book that me and the overseers went through together this summer, and me and the staff are going through this fall, of really just looking at what does it look like to be faithful when we're in exile in a foreign land, and sort of the positive side of that, how do we do that well? So if you're looking to dig deeper, and if you want any of those books, just come and let me know. I've got a copy for you. All right. Hopefully I gave you enough time to find your way to Daniel chapter 2, verse 24. So let's dig in. It says this: Then Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to execute the wise men of Babylon, and he said to him, Do not execute the wise men of Babylon. Take me to the king. I will interpret his dream for him. Then Arioch took Daniel to the king at once and said, I have found a man among the exiles from Judah who can tell the king what his dreams mean. The king asked Daniel, also called Belteshazzar, Are you able to tell me what I saw in my dream and interpret it? Daniel replies, No wise man, enchanter, magician, diviner can explain to the king the mystery he is asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in days to come. I love this opening. It's interesting. Arioch, the king's servant, actually tries to take credit for Daniel's being able to come. I found a guy. I searched all the land and found the guy who can tell the answer. When in reality, he went to execute him at his door and he persuaded him to take him back to the king. But Daniel, on the other hand, he shows great humility. He actually agrees, if you remember the first half of chapter 2, with what the wise men had said. No wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can possibly explain to the king the mystery he's asked about. But then in great storytelling fashion, he reveals that there is someone who can, and it's God. And Daniel could have easily taken the credit here, but he takes the humble route. And he makes it clear that this message comes from God, and he's just here to share it. So we go on. He says to the king, Your dream and the visions that passed through your mind as you were lying in bed are these. As your majesty was lying there, your mind turned to things to come, and the revealer of mysteries showed you what is going to happen. As for me, this mystery has been revealed to me, not because I have greater wisdom than anyone else alive, but so that your majesty may know the interpretation and that you may understand what went through your mind. Again, I appreciate the humility that we're seeing from Daniel in this part of the story. He doesn't want it to be all about him. In fact, he even makes it clear, he's like, King, I am here to serve you. I'm here to share this vision because God gave it to me, and because it will ease your mind. It will make clear to you what was going on in your dream. If you've ever been, we've talked in the last few months about what does it look like to give glory to God in all that you do. This is a fantastic example. Let's continue on. Verse 31. Your majesty looked, and there before you, this is the dream now, stood a large statue, an enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance. The head of the statue was made of pure gold, the chest and the arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, and the legs of iron, and its feet partly of iron, partly of baked clay. While you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, the gold were all broken into pieces and became like chaff on a threshing floor in the summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace. But the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. This was the dream, and now we will interpret it to the king. So right out of the gate, he impresses by verbatim giving the exact what happened in the dream to King Nebuchadnezzar. It's an interesting dream. It depicts this statue. There's many versions of this online if you want to go and take a look. But this statue with this head of gold and the silver, and the metals keep becoming a little less valuable as we go down the statue, which is going to play into the interpretation we have in a moment. And he says that it comes and it's destroyed and everything is swept away without leaving a trace. So now let's go to the interpretation. Verse 37, he says, Your Majesty, you are the King of Kings. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory. In your hands he has placed all mankind and the beasts of the field and the birds in the sky. Wherever they live, he has made you ruler over them all. You, King Nebuchadnezzar, are that head of gold. Well, that's a good start for the king in this interpretation. O Majesty, King of Kings, you are in charge. You are in charge of the birds that roam about in your kingdom. It's an interesting thing to say. And I'm sure right now the king is hearing this and he's like, say it again, right? He's enjoying this. He's taking it in. He's a little terrified, but in this moment, at least he's a little encouraged. But notice, Daniel's not being flippant when he says, yes, you're king of all the people, but also the birds in the sky. He's specifically using Genesis language, which we're going to come back to in just a minute, to give us this idea of how he's describing the king. Verse 39, we're almost there. This is a long section. After you, King Nebuchadnezzar, another kingdom will arise, inferior to yours. Then a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule over the whole earth. And then finally there will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, for iron breaks and smashes everything. And as iron breaks things to pieces, so it will crush and break all others. Just as you saw that the feet and toes were partly of baked clay and partly of iron, so this will be a divided kingdom, yet it will have some of the strength of iron, and even as you saw iron mixed with clay. As the toes were partly iron and partly clay, so this kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle. And just as you saw the iron mixed with baked clay, so the people will be a mixture, and will not remain united any more than iron mixes with clay. And you might be thinking, that has a lot of detail about iron and clay and toes, and like why does Daniel go into that? We're not going to get into all of that, but these descriptions give us clues to understanding which future kingdoms were being spoken about by Daniel in this passage. But the big idea here in this interpretation, so this is a picture to give you one person's interpretation of which future kingdoms that it might possibly have been talking about if you want to explore that further. But the big idea here is that now we're getting the other side of the coin of this story. We're understanding that King Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom is temporary. Daniel's saying it's going to be destroyed. And all subsequent kingdoms that are lesser than yours, O great king, as he's speaking it, right, are going to also be destroyed. But there's actually a kingdom out there that is going to one day take its place, and it's going to come down as a rock to destroy those kingdoms, and in its place will be a mountain that rises up, a mountain that represents permanence and eternity and an indestructible nature. It will replace all other kingdoms. This kingdom is represented by that rock. Now, clearly, this is foreshadowing to Jesus, and we're going to talk about that in a minute here. And sometimes I find it really difficult to understand visions, and when we get later into Daniel, it's going to be hard to understand some of what he's trying to say to us. But in this place, I find comfort that it's very clear for us to understand what Daniel's talking about. Now let's wrap this passage up, verse 46, or 44. In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of the mountain, but not by human hands, a rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold to pieces. The great God has shown the king what will take place in the future. The dream is true, and its interpretation is trustworthy. Now that is a lot of authority to speak with to the king. The king has said, tell me what my dream was and tell me how to understand it. And now Daniel trusts in the vision that he has because it came from God. But it still takes some courage to stand before the king and say, this dream is true, its interpretation is trustworthy, you can take it to the bank, King Nebuchadnezzar. I'm thankful for this passage and the clarity that it provides us. But even with a king, as we come to process this whole story and what we've seen, even a king as corrupt and self-absorbed as Nebuchadnezzar, in this moment, he can't deny the true God when he comes face to face with him, and that's how the story wraps up. It says, then the king fell prostrate before Daniel and paid him honor in order that an offering and incense be presented to him. The king said to Daniel, surely your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings, and a revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery. Then the king places Daniel in a high position and lavishes him with many gifts. He makes him rule over the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of all its wise men. Moreover, at Daniel's request, the king appointed his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, administrators over the provinces of Babylon, while Daniel himself remained at the royal court. I love this. In this moment, King Nebuchadnezzar sees God for who he really is, and his perspective on the world has changed. He could have been filled with rage. He could have just decided to execute the wise men and other people as well, just to satisfy his rage and his frustration with what's been told to him. But instead, he sees God for who he really is. He can't deny the true God, because when God comes towards us, when he seeks us, he comes in such a strong way that it can't be denied. I love seeing God's love and power at work on display for us as he pushes through the barriers of sin and flesh that we carry that keep us from knowing and seeing God clearly. It's an incredible story. It's an incredible story, but what does it mean? What does it mean for us? What are we to take away from this story? I want to make 3 quick observations that I think are helpful for us as we process what just happened as Daniel reveals the vision and the king is confronted with the temporary nature of his kingdom and subsequent kingdoms, which would have been his legacy. The first thing is this: the king of Babylon is not my true king. He's not our true king. And I'm not just talking about Nebuchadnezzar. That's where it starts with our story today. But no king in the Babylon of Daniel 2 or in any future Babylon is our true king. All of our presidents and earthly leaders have a role to play in God's plan for our world, but none of them are the true king. God makes that so clear in this vision. And as strong and capable as King Nebuchadnezzar was, and history books will say and will show that he was one of the strongest kings in the history of the world, he had many faults, he had many inadequacies, and God uses this dream to humble him, to make it clear who's really in charge of our world. God shows that he's in control. And this story clearly shows that all earthly empires, leaders, strongholds, all of them are temporary. They'll eventually be no different than, as the passage says, the dust that gets blown away in the wind. That's frustrating. A little bit frustrating to hear anything that we could build or construct in this world has a temporary nature to it, no matter how grand or how vast. But 2 Corinthians helps us to understand this as well. It says, so we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. Since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. In other words, everything we can see with our eyes is temporary. It's like if Mufasa had said to Simba when they were out on the cliff, "Simba, everything that the sun touches will one day be gone." Now that's a little dark. Maybe you don't want to tell your small child that. It's better to say, "Will one day be yours. This is your legacy. This is for you to carry on and to reign over." I think Disney got it right on that one. It's a better story. But that's kind of what this vision is trying to communicate to us and remind us of. This is a temporary world that we live in. And I actually think that's good news. It's good news for us that the earthly kingdoms that we are under are temporary. This is a part of the vision of hope that Daniel is giving to us as we're looking for some hope to help us as we struggle, as we walk through a life in exile. Part of our vision for hope is understanding that this world is temporary, that the kingdoms in this world, no matter what we think of them, are temporary. In our country, every 4 or 8 years, we're fortunate to have a leadership change. And I'm thankful that we don't have the same president for decades upon decades. But even though we know it's only going to last a few years, how often do you get to the end of an election and the guy that you wanted to win doesn't win and you go, "Oh, it's all going to fall down. It's all going to crumble." I hear it every Wednesday after Election Day. Just this despair when it's not your guy that gets in. But we get to the end of the 4 or 8 years, whatever it is, and we realize things didn't go maybe as badly as we thought they would. And even if our guy did get in, things usually didn't go as well as we thought they would. No matter who wins or who's currently leading in our country, I always find hope in the knowledge that there's a temporal nature to the reign. There's a temporal nature to it. And Daniel's trying to remind us of that. No matter what your governmental structure is, there's a temporal nature to it, and the king of any Babylon is not our true king. The second thing that Daniel's teaching us this morning is that human authorities tend to distort the image of God. Now, I mentioned we're going to come back to the Genesis passage. Everything in the Bible in some way goes back to the first 3 chapters of Genesis. It's helpful and instructive to us. But King Nebuchadnezzar was not the first, and he wasn't the last leader to distort the image of God. Now, why do I say that he did that? Because God created us in his image, and we were literally designed to point one another to God by being human, by reflecting ourselves, reflecting God in ourselves. And Genesis paints this picture for us. It says, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and the livestock and all the wild animals and over all the creatures that move along the ground." Sound familiar to the vision? So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he made them. And God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground." When God created us, he created us in his image, and he created us to rule over creation. Now, that's not the only thing he made us to do, but in Genesis 1, he makes it clear this is part of what he made us to do. So how do we image God through our ruling? Well, one way is we create things. It says to multiply. So sometimes we make more humans, and sometimes we make spaghetti art that goes on the fridge, or we make pillow forts, or we write a song, or we create some new kind of technology. But in our creating of things, we are imaging the Creator. And then there's some of us that get to rule over one another. And some of us are put into a position of authority. And now we don't always talk about it as ruling over others. Like if you are the manager at Casey's, you don't say like, "I'm the ruler of Casey's." That's weird. Now, your fellow employees might think you think that, but that's not how we actually think about it. When we create, when we rule, we reflect God's image. But here's the thing about ruling over others in any capacity. At some point, our sinful nature comes in And as they say, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that's what we see with King Nebuchadnezzar. And that's what happens to our modern leaders as well. But when we rule like King Nebuchadnezzar, we distort the image of God because we are the image of God. God created us to be his image. When people look at us, they're able to see God. And we can use that image to clearly reflect him for who he really is, or we can use that image to very poorly and inaccurately portray who God is. So sometimes the picture gets distorted. It gets fuzzy because of the way that we're choosing to live. But God says, I am in control. So in King Nebuchadnezzar's dream, his distorted image gets destroyed, it crumbles, and it's replaced by something better. Tim Mackey says this, the human image of God in the world, and in speaking about Daniel specifically, he says the human image of God in the world through King Nebuchadnezzar has become an idolatrous exaltation of power and selfishness. And who is the head of the idol? The golden part of it? A guy who wakes up grumpy and decides to take people's lives. It's the ultimate distortion of human purpose. King Nebuchadnezzar and all other leaders like him represent a complete distortion of the image of God. But Daniel's vision reminds us that the king of Babylon is not the true king, and human authorities tend to distort the image of God. So what is our third thing we pull out of this? There is a kingdom coming that is everlasting, and it's God's kingdom. There is a kingdom coming that is everlasting, and it's God's kingdom. And in this vision, it comes in the form of a rock that comes down to the earth to overcome the other kingdoms and to replace them with something everlasting. God's kingdom can't be destroyed. It has no end. And it's the only kingdom worthy of our true hope. It's the only reliable kingdom. I appreciate what Hebrews 1 says when it paints this picture of God's kingdom versus earthly kingdoms. It says, in the beginning, Lord, oops, that is the wrong verse. I will read it from my notes. In the beginning, Lord, you laid down the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. They will all wear out like a garment. You will roll them up like a robe. Like a garment, they will be changed. But you remain the same. Your years will never end. He's describing this picture of the temporal nature of all other kingdoms and the strength of God's. So we see this full picture, this vision that we're given. The kings and kingdoms of this earth are temporary, and that's a good part of our vision of hope. And the other side of that coin is that God provides a kingdom that is eternal, that won't perish, that won't ever end. So when we're going through challenging times, when we're faced with needing encouragement and hope, as we're walking through our own Babylon, this is the vision that is provided to us. The things that are fighting against us are temporary, and the thing that gives us eternal hope is steadfast and sure and indestructible. So what do we do with this? A couple questions for you here as we process what these truths mean for us. And the first is this. I want to ask you this question. Why should I, and it's a little rhetorical, but why should I not give in and follow the current of culture? We've talked about this since the beginning of this study. Why do we not follow the currents of our world and find hope in what they have to offer? Because as this vision has pointed out to us, they're all temporary. The permanence and power of human nations is an illusion. I'll say that one more time. The permanence and power of human nations is an illusion, and God busts that illusion for us in this vision. Things that are temporary and fleeting, like kings and presidents, are not reliable or a safe place for us to put our hope or our identity. Because as soon as we place our hope in them, they're gone. And it's not just leaders, it's everything else in this world. And I don't say this to be discouraging, but just to help us with this reality, right? It's the same with clothing trends. When I was in high school, we wore baggy jeans and shorts that maybe almost went down to your ankles. It was like pre-capris. And now we have Crocs and all kinds of different, I don't even know what the current cultural, clearly I don't know what the current cultural style is. I'm hoping Zubas come back, but I'm not counting on it. If you know, you know. I'm not going to show you a picture. I'm just committed to flannel to the end. But anyway, I digress. everything is temporary. And of course, we're always going to be tempted to find hope in these things. So here's my reminder, here's my encouragement to you as we try to answer this question. When you know that something's temporary, it becomes so much easier to resist. When you know that something's temporary, it becomes so much easier to resist. Remind yourself daily of the temporal nature of our world and culture, and it'll be easier to resist its wiles. It'll be easier to resist the hope that it offers you. The second question that we have to answer this morning is this: why is Jesus our true hope? Why is he our true hope? Jesus is the rock that comes down to destroy the statue in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And it forms a mountain in its place. And it doesn't just come down to destroy the image of future kingdoms that won't last. It's also destroying a human image that has distorted its reflection of God. And that rock comes down to us to redeem the distorted image, to show us what a pure version of the image of God looks like, without distortion of sin. But the way Jesus does this is so unique, and this is what makes him our true hope. He overcomes the world in a way that both his enemies and his followers did not expect. At the end of his life and ministry, after teaching and doing incredible things, he rides into Jerusalem in a very public way. He's hailed as King and Messiah. He's the one everyone's been waiting for. People line the streets. He comes down the middle. He's riding in as their king. Only he didn't come into Jerusalem and conquer the world and take charge in the way that we all expected. Instead, he served people. He sacrificed for them. He said, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. And on his last night with the disciples, he reveals to them that he's the Messiah and the King. And he says, you're going to have a lot of trouble that comes your way, but have peace because I have conquered the world. And I think they're looking at each other confused, like, Jesus, you didn't do what we thought you were going to do. You didn't come in and conquer Jerusalem. We'd love for you to do that, but you didn't do that. So how does Jesus overcome the world? Jesus is beaten. Jesus is flogged. Jesus is executed. What are the marks that he becomes king in our New Testament story? Well, during his betrayal and his death, he receives a crown of thorns. He receives a robe, and he's lifted up on a cross and exalted, but in a mocking gesture. He's given the title, the King of the Jews. But this isn't done in honor, it's done in mockery by those humans who are supposed to be imaging God. And then Jesus brings the smashing rock of the dream to fulfillment by letting himself be smashed so that he can become the hope of our world. God's kingdom was established in this world by exposing the ridiculous hypocrisy of what human kingdoms are all about, as the human kingdom executes the only perfect person to walk the face of the earth. Colossians 2:15 says, having disarmed the powers and authorities, Jesus made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. This is not how we expect and hope for our world to be overcome. But Christ reveals to us that he is the solid rock on which we stand by sacrificing himself for our sake. And that's what we want to think about as we come to the Lord's table this morning, as we come to the bread and the cup. We're going to remember what Jesus did. We're going to remember that he is that rock, that we can firmly stand on, that hope that we have because of the sacrifice that he made. He is the perfect image of our Heavenly Father. So I want us to take some time now to remember what he's done for us, to reflect on our own lives and which aspects of our lives that we may be struggling to be faithful to Jesus, and repent of any sin that is revealed to us as we come to this time of reflection, to turn away from the temporal things and turn to our eternal Savior. And I just want to encourage you to refocus. Use this time to refocus on Jesus. Ask him to empower you to greater faithfulness in your life, that you might walk with Him in a way that brings honor and glory to God because of what He has done in your life.